Christopher Petrella is a PhD student in UC Berkeley's Department of African American Studies. His research focuses on race, class, incarceration. He's also a featured blogger at Nation of Change. Chris, you sent me these notes about what you see as a connection that's worth discussing between hyperincarceration in the United States, which is a topic we talk about a lot on this program, and Occupy Wall Street. Tell me, what do you have in mind here for our audience?
Sure. Well, I think the way it might be helpful to begin would be to think about what Professor David Harvey at the City University of New York states the government does, or the state does, during moments of economic crisis. And the term he uses is accumulation by dispossession, which basically means divesting citizens of rights and assets in order to, at least as it's justified, in order to restabilize or bring equilibrium back to the economy. And what we see now is accumulation by dispossession being operationalized in two ways. One is through personal indebtedness, and think, for example, a structural readjustment policy on sort of an individual register. And a fine instance of this would be the fact that graduates of colleges and universities right now are coming out with the student debt load on average of about $24,000 a year. That's just for a bachelor's degree, never mind a master's or anything beyond that. And the second strategy is to redistribute or externalize costs from the state body to citizens. And we see this happening both in public higher education that's being privatized, and publicly owned and operated prison facilities that are also being privatized. And if I could, just a quick example. We know, for example, I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley. We know, for example, that the Board of Regents are proposing around an 81% fee increase. And at Berkeley, fee is the euphemistic term we use for tuition. An 81% tuition increase over the next 4 years at a time that the state is facing budget crisis, which means that we as taxpayers in the state are actually enduring a form of double taxation. We're paying for our education in the form of taxes and other social services, of course, but then we're being taxed on top of that with this fee increase. And then in prisons, for example, just last month, the Riverside, California County of Board of Directors at the Riverside County level decided that they were going to begin charging prisoners $142.42 per day for their stay. So it's a pay-to-pay program, and you see again the burden, the cost being shifted from the state back to the most vulnerable who don't have the money to begin with anyway.
Yeah, we did that story about the California prison charging inmates. And, I think it's interesting because they both will eventually have the same undesired opposite effect of maybe why they're intended to be put in there. I mean, with the prison example, we were saying if you do charge someone for being in prison and when they leave prison they have absolutely no money, you're creating a situation much more likely for them to commit a crime that'll land them back in prison. In other words, it's actually having the opposite effect of making someone no longer a criminal. Same thing I think could apply to the overwhelming student loan debt burden, right? In other words, if people have this incredible student loan debt, they are not necessarily in the criminal sense, but they're going to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do if they were more free, in other words, to kind of pursue what they want to do. So is that another similarity?
It is, yeah. I mean, to speak on your first point, we know, for example, that in California, the state of California has the highest recidivism rate in the country. And recidivism is a term that basically refers to the percentage of prisoners after 3 years of release that end up back in a penal institution. And currently in California, the number stands at about 72%, which is loathsomely high. And I agree with you. One of the very best strategies for reducing the rate of recidivism would be to make sure that inmates, upon their release, aren't shouldering debt burdens that are going to put undue strain on their ability, of course, to repay or to get a job, for example. So I agree. And then, of course, to your second point, in public education, particularly at the level of public higher education, we see a lot of very, very bright students, a lot of students who are publicly minded and want to work, in the realm of sort of public service more generally, finding that they, have very few options and then end up on Wall Street for lack of better option because they're shouldering such a large debt load.
Talk a little bit about hyperincarceration in the U.S. I mean, the statistics are very clear. 5% of the world's population is in the U.S. 25% of the world's prisoners are in the U.S. Now, a very superficial approach might say, if there weren't so many nonviolent drug offenses that landed people in jail, that would solve a huge portion of it. But is that realistic to think that? How big of a problem is the jailing of nonviolent drug offenders?
Nonviolent drug offenders. It's a problem of excuse the pun, but capital proportions. It's egregious. I mean, I'll give you an example. So I'm 27 years old. I was born in 1984. Since 1984, the number of bodies incarcerated in this country has burgeoned by 400% at a time when the population has grown 10 times as slowly. The number of private prison facilities since 1984 has grown by 4,000%. There are now, about 10% or so of prisons are for-profit facilities or private facilities private contracts given by the federal government. And we see a situation now where in private and public prisons, about 70%, for example, of people of color are incarcerated for nonviolent drug-related offenses. And there are statistics on this, and I'd like to share one. We found that if the state of California, for example, emptied its prisons and released every single inmate, the state and sent all of these former prisoners to UC Berkeley, UC Merced, any of the UCs, the state would actually save about $7 billion per year.
In other words, paying for their education would be much cheaper than what it costs to have them in prison.
Indeed, it's very clear. I mean, the tuition at UC Berkeley right now, although rising at sort of at rates far outstripping inflation, is still far less than it costs to incarcerate someone in a medium security facility. For example, I teach a number of courses at San Quentin, and at San Quentin, the cost of incarcerating a prisoner is about $47,000. That's in 2010. That's up from about $30,000 in 1990. And we're talking, David, this is a generally medium security facility. Death row inmates at San Quentin cost nearly $200,000 to incarcerate per year. So from a budgetary perspective, which is a very slim sort of metric, of course, this makes absolutely no sense.
It's incredible, Chris, and there's so much more to get into, and unfortunately we're just out of time, but we'll absolutely have to have you back. Chris Petrella is a PhD student at UC Berkeley's Department of African American Studies. He's also a featured blogger at Nation of Change. Really great to talk to you, Chris.
David, thank you so much.